There's also recently been the work of Professor Klaus Schmidt, and the first temple has been excavated, a religious temple, at a place called Göbekli Tepe, if I pronounced it correctly. Again in the same area. We also find that the people who study language have come to the conclusion the first proto-language, the original language, was in the same region. And here's an article from Scientific American, March 1990. It says, the landscape described by the proto-language has now resolved must be somewhere in the crescent that curves around the southern shores of the Black Sea, south from the Balkan Peninsula, east across the ancient Anatolia, today the non-European territories of Turkey, and north to the Caucasus Mountains. So again, confirming the sort of the general biblical picture we do have of Genesis. Now let's have a look. Ararat and where Noah and his family began. According to Genesis and the Hebrews, of course, they speak about Ararat, and Ararat indeed was not just a range of mountains, it became a place just below the mountains. But the Sumerians also refer to the same place, except they call it Arata. You get the Assyrians calling it Urartu, basically the same place, and it was famous and mentioned in their clay tablets very early on. So where was it? Well, there was a king in the ancient Mesopotamian civilizations called King Enmerkar, which some people consider was Nimrod, mentioned in Genesis. And he set up a big ziggurat, a temple at Eridu, which is biblically known as Irad. And he was also the king of Uruk, which is biblically in Genesis is called Erech. He went off to the land of Arata to get materials with which to build his ziggurat temples. So he went off to Arata, which is basically the modern-day Armenia. And he didn't just go in to get precious stones, but also metal and that type of thing. Presumably he went to Medzamor. We saw that earlier in the slide, to get various metals and have things done. But he also insisted on getting one of the gods. And a lot of these kings regarded that their gods, it was actually ancestor worship. We'll get onto that a bit later. And why did he want to build a big ziggurat down on the Mesopotamian plain? Well, because as the earth settled down after the Great Flood, there were local floods. And of course, it's very flat there, and it's not, it's not so good. So if you can't have a mountain, you make one. So that's what the ziggurat, the temple. And it was actually at 7 levels, because there were 7 passes you had to get through to get back to the kingdom of Arata to get all your materials you needed. And in the actual temple, kind of Tower of Babel, there would have been the gods, which were idols, and in celebration of the ancestors, ancestor worship. So it gives you some idea of what was actually going on as a backdrop. Here we have a modern map of Ararat, and that's the archaeological Urartu, as you see, bounded by the red lines. And again, if you see those two pictures, the picture of the 2 lakes, Lake Van on the left-hand side, and just below it on the right-hand side is Lake Urmia. Just north of it, you might not be able to see it in green, Mount Ararat Range, just there. So that's a place of really special archaeological significance these days. Well, let's have a look at the founders of the New World after the flood, the sons of Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Now, if you look at that map, you'll see there are 3 color-coded, 3 colors, the green representing Ham and his descendants, the Hamites. And if you notice, they mostly spread down from, obviously came down from Ararat, and through, partly through the Middle East, and mostly spreading through Africa. Some of them ending up in the southern peninsula of Arabia. But as we'll find out, also some of them went through into Samaria and through into parts of India as well. If you look at the map, the colour of the brown, that's Shem. Of course, Shem was the father of the Shemites, or Semites. Of course, we get the word Semitic. It's still a word in usage. And they mostly settled in the Arabian Peninsula, but again, parts of the Middle East and partly into Europe. We'll find out later why. And Japheth spread far and wide. Quite extraordinary how his descendants spread right through parts of the Middle East, right through to Iraq, Iran, through to Asia, the Far East, and also through Europe and beyond. Don't bother to look at those names. I don't think you'll be able to read them all from there. It's just to give you some idea of the Genesis 10. It just gives you some of these names and some of the descendants that came out of it as they dotted and spread. They're dotted on that map and as they spread out. So let's look at Ham. Well, Ham, as I said, and his descendants spread into Africa. And parts of ancient Egypt were known as Kemet, and that's obviously a derivation from Ham. We find from the pagan historian Plutarch from the 1st century AD that he refers to it as Chemia, the country of Ham. So basically in the ancient world it was very well known that that's where Ham and his descendants had spread into Africa, which agrees exactly with what Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian, speaks about. Now let's look at some of the sons of Ham. Cush being one of the most famous ones, and it basically became known, we call it today the area of Ethiopia, but the Egyptians referred to it as Kos or Kosh. So you can see the following of that name Cush. The Assyrians, on their hand, referred to it as Kushu. Now, Josephus says, "For of the 4 sons of Ham, time has not at all hurt the name of Cush, for the Ethiopians, over whom he reigned, are even at this day, both by themselves and by all men in Asia, called Cushites." So he's basically saying the descendants of Ham, the Cushites, were mostly in Africa, but some also spread into Asia, and we'll follow this through. Herodotus, who's a pagan historian from the 5th century BC, also speaks about the Ethiopians. And they both spread into Africa and to Asia. He confirms that. So let's look at the Cushites in Samaria as they went through into Asia via Iraq. Now there's a place, this picture you've got here is the ruins that was excavated in Iraq, about 12 miles from Babylon, named Kish in the ancient Mesopotamian clay tablet records. There is a clay tablet which is housed in the British Museum, which speaks about this, and it says, "The flood came up. After the flood had come up, kingship descended from heaven." The kingship was at Kish or Cush. And of course they have many records of the flood. But what they speak about is the kingship, the kings first coming from heaven. Well, in their viewpoint, and you'll see this in ancient records, the mountain was very, very key, coming down from the clouds, coming down from the mountain, down to the plain, to our level. You get this, for example, Mount Olympus in the Greeks. You have the gods up on Mount Olympus, and it's many ancient cultures. You have the Hindus, you have many other cultures, the high places. So the people were coming down, but they were first kings at Kish. Now, there's an interesting thing, because it was there, from that time onwards, we'll find the son Nimrod, the son of Cush, is where empires first began. And we'll trace this through. Some scholars reckon that King Mesiag-Kashur, in the king records of ancient Mesopotamia, could possibly be the Cush mentioned in Genesis. Now let's look at some of these Cushites as they spread in Samaria and India, which you might be surprised about. King Sargon, an Assyrian from about 2100 BC, said something quite derogatory, but here we are. This is what he said. "For 45 years, the kingdom I have ruled, and the blackheads I have governed." He's referring to dark-skinned people and their dark curly hair. And basically what he's speaking about is the Cushites. And they were there before him, and he came and conquered them, and he set up an empire. We find from the book of Sothis, which is a record from the time of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, about the 14th century BC, he speaks about the Ethiopians removing from the river Indus, which is the Indus Valley civilization, dark-skinned Dravidian people before the Aryans came later on. And they came from India and they settled in Egypt, next to their cousins in Ethiopia. So we find some of these records there.